Good evening, and welcome again, my friends, to Mulenge Speaks project or series. Today we'll be speaking about to continue the migration of the Banyarwanda in the Bavira and in the Babembe and in the Barega territory or kingdoms. We touched the subject of their migration or immigration into the Bafuliru land, and we spoke a little bit about their migration or immigration into the Bavira land. We said that West, Mr. George West, recorded or counted them in the villages, in 3 villages in the lower versant of the mountain or the plateau, in the village of Galie, Kishembwe, Munanira, and Kataka. And we saw that at page 118 of his book, the Bavira or the Vira country. We also saw that Mr. West was very clear about those Banyarwanda who were in those villages. He was clear that in 3 pages, in page 116, in page 118, in page 148, he said that the Banyarwanda were semi-nomadic people. They moved from the Bafuliru land to the Bavira land, and they settled in the Bavira land, especially in 3 villages, in 4 villages, excuse me, in Galie, Kishembwe, Munanira, and Kataka. Then he continued on page 119, and he said this, that the colonial administration often ignored the existence of population. He meant the population, the Banyarwanda. Why? Because they were suspicious about them, but they could not pay taxes. They could not submit to the rule and regulations that they were proposing during that period of colonial period, and so they were suspicious about them. And then, since they are semi-nomadic people, they moved a lot. So they start moving from those villages, and then they push toward the west. And when they push toward the west, they pass through the Muhulu forest to the occidental border of the Sheferi with the Barega territory or Barega people. And in those area of around the occidental part of the Sheferi, there were 3 other villages. The village of Bijombo, the village of Kianjovu, and the village of Masango, Tutanga. So, according to West, George West, in 1952, when he went there to study the Bavira people, he discovered that there were so many people living in that area, including the Banyarwanda. And so his census of 1952 was about 3,548 individuals in those villages at the western part of the Sheferi, at the border with the Barega people. And then he said this, that at page 120, he counted 2 Banyarwanda who arrived in 1938. And those 2 arrived in the village of Masango. In Bijombo, he counted other people who arrived in 1946. And those in Kianjovu arrived in 1947. He continued to say, in total, 3/4 of the population were fixed much more recent than in the Rwanda village. I repeat, he said in total 3/4 of the population were fixed only by 1950, and the immigration continued. Current settlement is much more recent than in the Rwanda village above the lake. So what he's saying here is saying that the Rwanda were living below the Haut Plateau, in the middle of Moyen Haut Plateau, in the village of Galie, Munanira, Kataka, and Kishembwe, were a little bit ancient or older than the people or the Banyarwanda were living in Masango, Bijombo, and Kianjovu. Later, from 1960, many Banyarwanda moved to Rwemba and Minembwe in the Fizi area. That's the Fizi which belong to the Babembe people or tribe. Then Tulambo and Itombwe in the Mwenga territory. We know that Mwenga is a Barega people territory. So from this first account here, we see that the Banyarwanda lived in two areas in the Bavira territory. They lived in below the Haut Plateau in the medium or the middle plateau, and then they moved toward the west at the border with the Barega country, and there they settled in those three other villages. But because they are semi-nomadic, they move a lot, so they push toward the west again. So they found themselves again in the western part of the Babembe area. They found themselves in Rwemba and Minembwe. Then they push upward a little bit in the west upward. They push into Tulambo and Itombwe in the Barega territory. But we also know from the history that in Tulambwe or Itombwe region, there was a project that was called Elite or Élevage d'Itombwe. We'll come back to that in the economic side of the story. But keep in mind that there was a project that was called Élevage d'Itombwe, where they were breeding the cattle. And that project was under the direction a colonial Western man called Ricard. And so he hired some Banyarwanda to take care of those cattle. We'll talk about that in the last part of this clip. So we can see from this movement that Banyarwanda moved from the Bafuliru territory into the Bavira territory, and they settled first in the Moyen Plateau or Middle Plateau in Galie, Kishembwe, Munanira, and Kataka. Then slowly they were moving all the way toward the west. And west, we saw in the last clip that how he said how these Banyarwanda, because they are semi-nomadic people, they move a lot. Constantly they move a lot. And so sometimes they abandon the whole villages and they move to go and increase the workforce in other villages. But what about the political status? What was their political status? We know that they come when they go out, when they go to protest about their rights, they accuse the indigenous tribes and the government or some administrations that they're against them, which may be true, but here we are talking about the customary rights. And so my focus is on the customary right, and when you are in a position of authority, you are a political figure. And so what was their political status while they were in that area where they were living into the Bavira territory? Because they claimed that the colonial authority and the Mwami or the king of the Bavira, and in extension the king of the Bafulero, took or destroyed their chefferie or their kingdom. But we know from the history or from the book that we have been presenting here, the book of George West and the PhD paper of Mr. De Persian, we know that they have never had any chieftaincy of their own. At page 32 of De Persian, we said, and he said, that the Banyarwanda have been living inside the Bafuliru and the Bavira chieftaincy. That's the history. And that's what we, the Bavira, the Bafulero, the Babembe, the Barega, and the Banyindu, we have been telling people. We have been telling the international community. We have no interest in lying, because we don't have interest in seeking the approval, seeking to show that we have some rights, because we belong to the area, we're the first in the area, we are Congolese of origin, and so we don't need to go out to claim the rights that are already belong to us. But these two researchers, when they came to study the area, they were not wrong. So they said what they saw. They interviewed the Bavira, the Babembe, the Bafuliru, even the Banyarwanda. And all along, during their studies, they never called the Banyarwanda another name. They always called them the Banyarwanda or the Rwanda. And they always distinguish them from the Congolese. If you read the books, you see that there's a difference between Congolese and Banyarwanda. We also saw in the Royal Decree of 1891 how in the first article, or Article 1 of that decree of 1891, it clearly stated that there were some indigenous of neighboring colony, and at that time already the Germans were entering into the Kingdom of Rwanda. So they knew that there were some people coming from the other side of the Ruzizi River that were entering into the Congo Free State. And so even the law of the law of 2015, the law that Joseph Kabila Kanambe signed into law, that he signed, that law instituted the chieftaincy or chefferie, the grouping or groupement, and the village and the quartier. So you can't have groupement without a chieftaincy. You cannot have a village without a grouping. You cannot have a grouping without the chieftaincy. So the three levels of authority go together. The chieftaincy, which is led by the king or roi, and then you have below him you have this the subgroup, which is the groupement. Then below that we have the village. And we know that many of the Batusi or the Banyarwanda were chief of village, but they were not chief of groupement. So we'll show that again in the next clip, that what they call groupement is not a groupement, is a village. But because they want to confuse you when you are listening to them, they will tell you that it was a groupement. So when they call groupement or grouping, you understand that they are talking about a level that is either at the same level with the king of a land, when it is not. So at the political level, the pursuit was consistent that the Banyarwanda were living in the chieftaincy of Bafuliru and Bavira. He said, for example, at page 32, that administratively the Rwanda do not have a chieftaincy of their own. They live in Fuliru and the Vira chieftaincy. Also, he said at page 48, I quote, the Rwandan from Rwanda had severed all ties with the Mwami of Rwanda. Their chiefs were in fact sub-chiefs who were subordinate to the Fuliru Mwami. So during their time in the Fuliru land, their chiefs were sub-chief. That means they were receiving order from the king of the Bafulero. So this is the reality of their political status. And then when they came into the Bavira land, we showed in those maps at page 110 and page 143. I'm gonna repeat again. I'm gonna show you these maps again. I'm gonna show this map again, and then here I want you to pay attention to what I'm saying here, because every time they come to tell you or to protest them, they are claiming their ancestral land. We have to know and we have to understand what they are talking about. So we have the area here, the map that I showed you. This is page 110, and then we have here, this is the Vira territory or Vira country. We have this here. This is a Kishembwe village, which was under the control of the chief of the Banyarwanda. But this Kishembwe village is in Rally Groupement, and the Rally Groupement is a subgroup of the Bavira chieftaincy. And Rally is a member or was a member of the royal family. We have down here, we have the Munanira. We have here, we have Gali, that is in the Ruekenya groupement. We have here Kataka, also is in the Ruharura groupement, and we have Munanira, which was in the Husseini groupement. So all these villages were the Banyarwanda villages are inside the Bavira groupement. So if they have any title at all, their title is the title of a village chief. And if they have the title of the village chief, that means they're under the chief of the groupement, which also the chief of the groupement give orders or report to the king of the whole land. That's their reality. So they did not have any political status and authority other than being the chief. Or the chief of the village, his job is to control the people in his village, and they give report to the chief of groupement. And I also showed you this map at page 143 of George West's book. Again, I'm gonna repeat it again, because we have here the Bavira land, we have the Bafuliro land, we have the border here. It says Mwenga. Mwenga, we don't have any other border between the Bavira and the Barega. And here, we don't have any other border between the Bafulero and the Bavira. So we can see that when the Banyarwanda are claiming that they have some groupement or they have some sheferi, this is in 1954. This man here did not find any other land that does not belong to these three categories of indigenous people. And at the bottom, there is a Fizi. So we have Fizi with a border with the Bavira, we have Mwenga with the border of the Bavira, and we have Bafulero with the border of the Bavira. And then we have at the north and west, we have the Bashi. So again, these are two maps that clearly states that there was no Munyarwanda who had any land. Of course, they were living inside this country or indigenous country, but they could not claim any political right because they were sub-chief, they were subordinate to the kings and chef de groupement that were living there. So we want to make that clear. When you come across them or across the Banyarwanda, you have to understand what we are saying. When they claim that they had some political authority, we have to understand which political authority they are talking about and at which level. Because the king is like the president of a country. Then you have the ministers. Then you have the secretary. Then we have the chief. The governor. Then we have the counties. So, like any other country, whether it's indigenous or modern country, they have constitution. And the constitution for any indigenous country or indigenous people, indigenous kingdom, they're the customs, the coutume in French. And so no one can become a coutumier if you are not a member of that royal family. No one can become a president of a country, a modern country, if you are not a citizen or born citizen of that country. So if it happened in the modern civilization or modern country, it does also happen in indigenous societies. That's how it works. Now, what about West himself? George West also was not ashamed to show that this map that we just showed here at page 10 and 143, that they clearly show that the village of Banyarwanda that they are claiming to have formed, or that have been represented in a groupement, what they call Budulege, they are not a groupement, they are just villages. And then we'll show a little bit down what George Bush wrote about this Budulege. For example, he wrote at page 148, the crest of Kirungu, for example, along the bed of Kalimabenge Mujaga rivers, at first attracted the Rwanda Kapita Budulege, who settled there and later in 1935 abandoned the site for the benefit of the Bavira and settled at the village of Kishembwe. I'm going to repeat that again. We know that the Banyarwanda are saying that they had one groupement, and that groupement was called Groupement Budulege. So they misinterpreted what West said. West said that those villages represented a groupement apart, a groupement, a set of groupement, because it was a group of Banyarwanda that they used to work to live together in those three villages. They were under one chief. But he did not say that that groupement was equal to the subdivision of the Sheferi in an administrative entity. And so now he's giving a clear definition, or a clear authority, a clear definition of the authority that this Budulege had. And so he's saying that the crest of the Kirungu, for example, along the bed of Kalimabenge Mujaga River, at first attracted the Rwanda Kapita Budulege. So he's saying that this Budulege was a Kapita, was a chef of village, and he was a Rwanda. He even in French, you see that he say he was a Rwandais. That means a Rwandais, in his definition, a Rwandais means a person who came to Congo during the territory of Rwanda-Urundi. So he even came after the first Rwandais came in, the Rwanda came into the Congo. All right. So in French, he says la crête de Kirungu, par exemple, sur l'interflige Kalimabenge Mugaja, attira d'abord le capita rwandais Budulege, qui s'y fixa, mais abandonna ultérieurement en 1935 les sites au Vira pour s'établir à Kishembwe, dans la dépression de la haute Kalimabenge, plus à l'ouest et en contact plus direct avec les plateaux pâtirables. So, George West is clear here that this Budulege here was not a chef de groupement. He was a capita, he was a chef of village, he was a village chief. And the village chief only controlled his people. And what the king were doing were, if you are a foreigner, if you are an immigrant, in order to control you, in order to administer you, they give you authority over your people so that it will be easy for them to collect taxes. And that's what they were doing. So when they claim that they had one group, they are lying to you. And that's what we are showing here on this page 148 of George West's book. He was clear that Budulege was not a chef de groupement, but he was a capita. And he mentioned, he made sure that he added the prefix Rwandais here. So Budulege was a Rwandais capita, so he was somebody from Rwanda. Rwanda here means somebody who came during the territory of Rwanda-Urundi, which was already a colony of the German. So as you read the history of who you are, your culture, your land, your tradition and practices, you will see that it takes an informed person to take the concept of capita or chief de village for a chief of the entire kingdom. And that's what they are trying to do. They are trying to sell to you that their people, their ancestors or their grandfather or their father used to be chef de chefferie. Oh, we know that chef de chefferie means a kingdom, a country. And we have seen that the time they came, these kingdoms were already existing. So I appeal to you, if you're watching me, to know your culture. It is very important that you know your culture, that you teach your children your culture. Because if you don't know your culture, somebody will come and take it away. This is not the first time people lose their language, their cultures. But to know your culture, to defend it, to promote it, to preserve it, there's nothing wrong with it. And so that's what we are trying to say. We have ancestral lands, we have ancestral sites, we have ancestral culture, and we have to protect them because those are those that make us be people. On the economic side, for example, we know that the Banyarwanda are telling us, or are telling the world outside there, that the colonial authority, the Babembe, the Bafulero, the Bavira, the Banyindu, even the Bashi and the Barega, are stealing their cattle. They used to steal their cattle. We even saw one example in the book of West where he talked about 11,000 cattle head, which is true. The number may be true, but I told you that I'll show you where they get those cattle head, 11,000. Because according to West and according to the Persian, they were coming in individual families. So if they are coming in individual families, how can I bring 11,000 cattle head in the different kingdom, in the foreign kingdom? It takes magic for a group of people to do that. And they were not coming in the group, they were coming as individual. So, for one thing, we read in the book of the Persian, at page 1, I'll read at page 156, 166, and 207. We know that we had two contracts in dealing with the Banyarwanda. The Bafulero and the Bavira, they are cattle breeders. We are not just agricultural people. We are not just fishermen people. We are not just hunters people. We also breed cattle, goats, cows, and pigs. We do all that. And so when the Banyarwanda came, and since they had the skill to breed the cattle, so we had two contracts. The first one was Ukubisa. That we found out at page 157 of the Persian paper. Ukubisa means the Bavira and the Bafulero who had cattle were taking their cattle and give them to the Banyarwanda since they had skills to take care of them. And so what they were doing, they were taking those cattle in the summer when the pastures are dry. They move into the plateau to look for green pastures. And so what they do, they'll take those cattle all the way in the mountain, and then after a while, the owner of the cattle, after 2 or 3 years, they will give them a steer. That's what they were doing. That's what the Persian writes here. He says, for example, on page 156, he says that when after the third or fourth calving, the Persian says, the owner will give a cow or a steer to the herder. After the fourth or the third or the fourth year, the owner will give the steer or a cow to the herder. And the herder here was a Munyarwanda or the Tutsi. But later, it was changed to Ukugabira. Ukugabira means now I'm giving you as a gift. After you have worked for me for a while, now I'm gonna give you a gift. So I give you for every 3 years, every 4 hours, I'm giving you a gift. So I'll give you another cow. So if if my cow produce three steers, then I'll give you one. And so later, as they move from the plain into the mountain, as they move from the Moyen Plateau into the high plateau, they are going far away from the owner of those cattle. And so he wrote here at page 166, he says, because they control cattle, the Tutsi could turn the Ukubisa contract to their own advantage. I repeat that again. Because they controlled cattle, the Tutsi could turn the Ukubisa contract to their advantage. So you are the one taking care of the cattle. You are moving away from the owner place. You are going into the bush, into the forest, into the whole plateau. You stay there for 6 months, 1 year, and then you come and tell the owner of the cows that maybe 3 or 4 cows have died. And that's how they were disappearing. And so at page 207, the Persian concluded, slowly the cattle owner realized that the relationship was becoming especially unequal when the contract took place between a Fuliru living in the valley and a Rwanda living on the high plateau. The distance between the depositor and the herder made it difficult for the owner to keep in touch and stay informed as to what was happening to his cattle. I'm going to repeat that again. It's at page 207 of the Persian paper. He said this, especially slowly the cattle owner realized that the relationship was becoming especially unequal when the contract took place between a Fuliru who was living in the valley and a Rwanda who was living on the high plateau. The distance between the depositor, who was the Fuliru or the Muvira, depending on the case, and the herder, who was here the Mnyarwanda, made it difficult for the owner to keep in touch and stay informed as to what was happening to his cattle. So those are proof that whatever number that the Banyarwanda had in those whole plateau, they did not bring them from Rwanda. They did not cross the Ruzizi River and the Lake Kivu with those cattle. Remember, they were coming as individual families. So to the point that they have now 10,000, 20,000, those were not their cattle. They were the cattle of the Bavira and Bafulero, who were placing them as a depositor into them because they had skills to breed the cattle. But as the Banyarwanda were moving from one village to another, from the east, from the Bafulero land in Lemera, in Kakamba, then they moved into the west, the lower west, into Galie, Kishembo, and the Munanira. Then they moved toward the upper area into the Muhulu forest. Then they crossed the Muhulu forest. They got into the Masango and Bijombo. Then after that, they had to cross into the Bubembe area, into the Luemba and the Minembwe. Then they push up into the Itombo. So we can see how they have been moving around with those cows and cattle that did not belong to them. And each year, they were increasing. But at the same time, the owner who were remaining in the plain, in the lower plateau, could not reach back to them. So it made sense that when George West came to study the Bavira people, he found a great number of cattle in the mountain, in the whole plateau. So he concluded that those cows belong to the Banyarwanda, but they were not for the Banyarwanda. They were cattle that were given to them to breed and to take care of, but because they were moving every season for search for green pastures, that's how the cattle were disappearing. They are disappearing. And so, my dear friend, I wanted to bring that to light to you, that there's a problem of communication. There's a problem of truthness here, because the Banyarwanda are lying. The Banyarwanda are spreading deception into across the international community, that they are being misused, they are being mistreated by the indigenous people because they have been taking their cattle, their land. But we have been showing from the history people that are still alive, from their own books and researches, that they came after the Bavira and Bafulero and the other tribe. And at the same time, when they were moving around, they were not sedentary. They were semi-nomadic people. They're moving constantly from one village to another. And then when they were taking those cattle that belonged to other people, they could not bring them back. So as they were receiving steers or other gifts from the owner, they were moving all the way away from them. So they never came back to the plain. And so they remained in the whole plateau with those cattle. So that's the story, and that's the truth that we want people to know. That the right, customary right, cannot be negotiable. They cannot be negotiated. The customary right, they predate the colonial time. They predate the exploration. They predate the time the Belgium came to Congo. They predate the time the German came to Rwanda. And so you cannot change that history. And so if you are in Congo, or if you want to become Congolese, that's not an indigenous issue. That's a national issue, that's a government issue. But we are talking here about indigenous rights, which cannot be negotiated, and they remain traditional, they're ancestral, the land, the culture, the language, and the tradition. And we hope that we made some clarification, and we hope to give you more clarification in the next time we speak about their citizenship based on the constitution and the law that were enacted during that period that they were in the Congo Free State. So thank you again for watching. I hope I did not take all your time, but for the sake of explaining what is going on, we think we have to do so that you can have the clear picture of what is going on in Eastern Congo in regard to the cohabitation between the indigenous people or tribes and the Banyarwanda, or what we call the Banyarwanda of Tutsi subgroup. Thank you again, good night, and hope to see you next time. So don't forget to read the description, and at the same time like or make a comment and share with friends, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.